The gavel slammed down with a sharp crack, echoing through the nearly empty courtroom. "Case dismissed," Judge Harold Grayson declared, his voice cold and final. He didn't even glance at the young black girl standing before him, her hands trembling as she clutched the edges of the podium. 16-year-old Maya Carter had spent weeks preparing for this moment, gathering evidence, rehearsing her testimony, and praying for justice. But in less than 10 minutes, it was over. The judge had barely let her speak, cutting her off mid-sentence with a dismissive wave of his hand. "This court has no time for frivolous claims," he'd said, his tone dripping with condescension. Maya felt the weight of his words crush her hopes, but what the judge didn't know, what no one in that courtroom knew, was that Maya wasn't just any teenager. She was the daughter of a high-ranking NSA officer, a man whose influence and reach extended far beyond the walls of that small-town courthouse. Maya had always known her father's job was important, but she never fully understood what it meant until that day. Colonel Marcus Carter wasn't just a government employee. He was a key player in some of the most classified operations in the country. He'd spent years working in the shadows, protecting national security, and making decisions that could alter the course of history. But to Maya, he was just Dad, the man who taught her how to ride a bike, who grilled burgers on summer weekends, and who always reminded her to stand up for what was right. So when Maya found herself at the center of a legal battle that seemed hopeless, she didn't tell him. She didn't want to burden him with her problems, not when he was already carrying the weight of the world on his shoulders. But now, as she stood in that courtroom, her dreams of justice shattered, she couldn't help but wonder if she'd made a mistake. The case had started months earlier, when Maya's school suspended her for defending herself against a bully. The boy, a popular athlete with a spotless reputation, had been harassing her for weeks, but when Maya finally stood up to him, she was the one who got in trouble. The school administration turned a blind eye to the boy's behavior, and when Maya tried to fight back through the legal system, she was met with the same indifference. Her lawyer, a young public defender named Sarah Bennett, had warned her that the odds were stacked against them. "The system isn't always fair," Sarah had said, her voice tinged with frustration. "But that doesn't mean we stop fighting." Maya had clung to those words, hoping that the truth would be enough to win. But as she left the courtroom that day, her heart heavy with defeat, she realized that the truth wasn't always enough. Not when the people in power refused to listen. What Maya didn't know was that her father had already been alerted to the situation. A colleague at the NSA, who had been keeping tabs on Maya's case as a personal favor, had called Marcus the moment the judge dismissed the case. "You need to see this," the colleague had said, sending over the court transcripts. Marcus's blood boiled as he read through the details, his fists clenching in anger. He had always taught Maya to fight for what was right, but now he realized that he had failed her in the most important way. He hadn't been there when she needed him most. As he picked up the phone to call his daughter, his mind raced with a single thought: this isn't over. Meanwhile, Judge Grayson sat in his chambers, unaware of the storm that was about to descend. On his quiet courtroom, he had dismissed Maya's case without a second thought, confident that his decision would go unchallenged. After all, who would dare question the authority of a judge? But as he sipped his coffee and flipped through the day's docket, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. There had been something in Maya's eyes, a quiet determination that didn't match the defeated posture of most plaintiffs. Who left his courtroom? He brushed the thought aside, telling himself that he had more important matters to attend to. But deep down, a nagging voice whispered that he had just made the biggest mistake of his career. As the sun set over the small town, Maya sat on the steps of the courthouse, her mind racing with questions. What would she do now? How could she move forward when the system had failed her so completely? She was still lost in thought when her phone buzzed with a text from her father. "We need to talk," it read. Maya's heart skipped a beat. She had no idea what her father was about to say, but something in his tone told her that this wasn't just a conversation. It was the beginning of something much bigger. Little did she know, the wheels of justice were already turning, and the man who had dismissed her case so casually was about to find himself in the crosshairs of one of the most powerful agencies in the world. The question was, would it be enough to set things right? Or would the system prove too broken, even for someone with Marcus Carter's influence? The answers would come, but not without a fight, one that would change everything. Maya stared at her phone, the words, "We need to talk," burning into her screen. Her father never texted like that. Short, direct, and with no room for interpretation. She felt a knot tighten in her stomach as she typed back a simple "okay." She didn't know what to expect, but the sinking feeling in her chest told her this wasn't going to be a casual conversation. She shoved her phone into her pocket and stood up, brushing the dust off her jeans. The courthouse loomed behind her, its tall columns casting long shadows in the fading light. It felt like a monument to everything that had gone wrong, a symbol of a system that had failed her. But as she walked away, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was about to change. When Maya got home, her father was already there, waiting for her in the living room. Colonel Marcus Carter wasn't a man who showed his emotions easily, but tonight, his face was a storm of anger and concern. He stood by the window, his broad shoulders tense, his hands clasped tightly behind his back. The room was quiet, the only sound the faint ticking of the clock on the wall. Maya hesitated in the doorway, unsure of what to say. She had always been close to her dad, but this felt different. This wasn't just about her anymore. It was about something bigger, something she didn't fully understand. "Sit down, Maya," Marcus said, his voice calm but firm. She obeyed, sinking into the couch as her father turned to face her. For a long moment, he just looked at her, his dark eyes searching hers. "Why didn't you tell me?" he finally asked, his voice softer now. Maya felt a lump rise in her throat. She had been so determined to handle this on her own, to prove that she could fight her own battles. But now, sitting in front of her father, she felt the weight of everything she'd been carrying. "I didn't want to bother you," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "You've got so much going on, and I thought I could handle it." Marcus sighed, running a hand over his closely cropped hair. "Maya, you're my daughter. Nothing is more important to me than you. You should have come to me." He paused, his jaw tightening. "But that's not why I'm upset. I'm upset because this shouldn't have happened in the first place. You shouldn't have had to fight this battle alone." He walked over to the couch and sat down beside her, his presence steady and reassuring. "Tell me everything," he said, "from the beginning." And so Maya did. She told him about the bullying, about the school's refusal to take her seriously, and about the court case that had ended in such a crushing defeat. As she spoke, she could see the anger building in her father's eyes, but he didn't interrupt. He just listened, his expression growing darker with every word. When she finished, he leaned back, his hands gripping the edge of the couch. "This isn't just about you," he said finally. "This is about a system that's broken, a system that protects the powerful and ignores the voices of people like you. But we're going to fix this. I promise you that." Maya wanted to believe him, but she couldn't shake the doubt that had settled in her chest. "How?" she asked, her voice trembling. "The judge dismissed the case. There's nothing we can do." Marcus shook his head, a small, determined smile playing on his lips. "You'd be surprised what we can do," he said. "But it's not going to be easy, and it's not going to be quick. Are you ready for that?" Maya nodded, though she wasn't entirely sure what she was agreeing to. All she knew was that she couldn't give up, not now, not after everything she'd been through. Meanwhile, Judge Harold Grayson was settling into his evening routine, oblivious to the storm that was brewing. He lived in a quiet neighborhood on the outskirts of town, in a house that was as unremarkable as he was. He had been a judge for over 20 years, and in that time, he had developed a reputation for being tough but fair. At least, that's what he told himself. The truth was, he had grown complacent, comfortable in his position of power. He rarely questioned his decisions, and he never second-guessed himself. But as he sat in his study that night, reviewing the day's cases, he couldn't shake the image of Maya Carter standing in his courtroom. There had been something in her eyes, something that made him uneasy. He tried to push the thought away, telling himself that he had made the right call. But deep down, he knew that wasn't entirely true. The next morning, Marcus Carter was already at work, his mind racing with plans. He had spent the night researching the case, gathering information, and reaching out to contacts who could help. As a high-ranking NSA officer, he had access to resources that most people could only dream of, and he wasn't afraid to use them. But he also knew that he had to be careful. If he pushed too hard, too fast, he risked drawing attention to himself and to Maya. He couldn't afford to make a mistake, not when so much was at stake. By mid-morning, he had arranged a meeting with Sarah Bennett, Maya's public defender. Sarah was young and idealistic, but she was also smart and resourceful. She had fought hard for Maya, even when the odds were against her, and Marcus respected that. When they met at a small cafe downtown, Sarah was visibly nervous. She had never met anyone like Marcus Carter before, and she wasn't sure what to expect. But as they talked, she realized that they shared the same goal: to get justice for Maya. "I've been looking into the judge," Sarah said, pulling out a folder filled with documents. "Judge Grayson has a history of dismissing cases like Maya's. He's known for being tough on plaintiffs, especially when they're young or marginalized. But there's something else, something I didn't notice before." She handed Marcus a sheet of paper, her hands trembling slightly. "This is a list of cases he's presided over in the last 5 years. Look at the pattern." Marcus scanned the document, his eyes narrowing as he saw what Sarah was pointing out. There was a clear trend. Cases involving powerful defendants were more likely to be dismissed, while cases involving ordinary people were treated much more harshly. It was subtle, but it was there. And it was enough to raise serious questions about Grayson's impartiality. Marcus leaned back in his chair, his mind racing. "This is good," he said finally. "But it's not enough. We need more. Something that will force the system to take notice." Sarah nodded, her expression grim. "I've been thinking the same thing. But it's not going to be easy. Grayson has a lot of friends in high places. If we go after him, we're going to make enemies." Marcus smiled, a cold, determined smile that sent a shiver down Sarah's spine. "I'm not afraid of making enemies," he said. "Not when it comes to my daughter." As the days turned into weeks, the tension continued to build. Marcus and Sarah worked tirelessly, gathering evidence, filing motions, and preparing for the battle ahead. Maya tried to stay focused, but it was hard. She felt like she was living in two worlds, one where she was just a teenager trying to get through high school, and another where she was at the center of a fight that could change everything. She didn't know what the future held, but she knew one thing for sure: this wasn't over. Not by a long shot. And then, one evening, as Maya was sitting at the kitchen table doing homework, her father walked in with a strange look on his face. "We've got a break," he said, holding up a piece of paper. "Something that could change everything." Maya's heart skipped a beat. "What is it?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Marcus hesitated, his eyes scanning the room as if he was afraid someone might be listening. "Not here," he said finally. "We'll talk about it later. But for now, just know this: we're closer than we've ever been." Maya nodded, though she didn't fully understand. All she knew was that something big was coming, something that would test them all in ways they couldn't yet imagine. And as she looked at her father, she realized that the fight was just beginning. Maya couldn't sleep that night. Her father's words echoed in her mind. Asterisk, "We're closer than we've ever been." Asterisk, what did that mean? What had he found? She tossed and turned, her thoughts racing as she tried to piece together the fragments of information she had. Her father had always been a man of few words, especially when it came to his work, but this felt different. This wasn't just about his job, it was about her, and that made it all the more terrifying. The next morning, Maya woke up to the sound of her father's voice downstairs. He was on the phone, speaking in low, urgent tones. She crept to the top of the stairs, straining to hear what he was saying. "I don't care how you get it," he said, his voice tight with frustration. "Just make sure it's airtight. We can't afford any mistakes." There was a pause, and then he added, "And keep this quiet. If anyone finds out, it's over." Maya's heart pounded as she tiptoed back to her room. Whatever her father was working on, it was big. And it was dangerous. At T-school, Maya tried to focus, but it was impossible. Her mind kept drifting back. To the case, to the judge, to the mysterious break her father had mentioned. She felt like she was living in two worlds. One where she was just a high school student trying to get through the day, and another where she was at the center of a storm she didn't fully understand. The bullying had stopped, at least for now, but the tension in the hallways was palpable. People whispered when she walked by, their eyes darting away when she looked at them. She didn't know if they were talking about the case or something else, but it didn't matter. She felt like an outsider in her own school. Meanwhile, Judge Harold Grayson was starting to feel the pressure. It had started with a few phone calls, colleagues asking if everything was okay, if he needed anything. At first, he brushed it off, assuming it was just the usual office politics. But then the calls became more frequent, more insistent. Someone had been asking questions about his cases, digging into his past, and it was making people nervous. Grayson tried to stay calm, but he couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. He had spent years building his reputation, carefully, cultivating an image of impartiality and authority. But now, for the first time, he felt like that image was starting to crack. That afternoon, Grayson received a visit from an old friend, a fellow judge named Evelyn Hayes. Evelyn was one of the few people Grayson trusted, and she had always been a voice of reason in his life. But today, she looked worried. "Harold, we need to talk," she said, closing the door to his chambers behind her. Grayson frowned, gesturing for her to sit. "What's going on?" he asked, though he already had a sinking feeling he knew the answer. Evelyn hesitated, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. "There's been some chatter," she said carefully, "about one of your recent cases, a dismissal involving a young girl." Grayson's stomach dropped. He had tried to push the memory of Maya Carter out of his mind, but now it came rushing back, sharper than ever. "What about it?" he asked, his voice tight. Evelyn leaned forward, her expression serious. "Someone's looking into it, Harold. And not just anyone. Someone with connections, high-level connections. If they dig too deep, it could cause problems. For all of us." Grayson felt a cold sweat break out on his forehead. He had always been careful, always made sure to cover his tracks. But now, for the first time, he wondered if he had been careful enough. "What do you suggest?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Evelyn sighed, her shoulders slumping. "I don't know," she admitted, "but you need to be prepared. If this goes south, it's not just your career on the line. It's your freedom." As Grayson sat in his chambers, staring at the wall, he felt a wave of panic wash over him. He had always believed he was untouchable, that his position protected him from the consequences of his actions. But now, for the first time, he wasn't so sure. He picked up the phone, his hands trembling as he dialed a number he hadn't used in years. "I need your help," he said when the person on the other end answered. "And I need it now." Back at the Carter household, Marcus was deep in conversation with Sarah Bennett. They had been working around the clock, piecing together the evidence they needed to take down Grayson. It wasn't just about Maya anymore. It was about exposing a system that had failed too many people for too long. "We've got enough to raise questions," Sarah said, spreading out a stack of documents on the kitchen table. "But we need something concrete, something that will force the higher-ups to take notice." Marcus nodded, his eyes scanning the papers. He had been in this business long enough to know how the game was played. You didn't win by playing fair. You won by being smarter, faster, and more determined than the other side. And Marcus was nothing if not determined. "What about Grayson's finances?" he asked, his voice low. "If we can find a connection, something that ties him to the defendants in those cases, we might have a shot." Sarah's eyes lit up. "That's not a bad idea," she said, pulling out her laptop. "I'll start digging, but it's going to take time." Marcus leaned back in his chair, his expression grim. "We don't have time," he said. "Every day we wait is another day Grayson has to cover his tracks. We need to move fast." As the two of them worked, Maya sat in the living room, her mind racing. She felt like she was standing on the edge of a cliff, waiting for the ground to give way. She didn't know what was going to happen, but she knew one thing for sure. Nothing would ever be the same. And as she looked at her father, his face set in a mask of determination, she realized that the fight was just beginning. The question was, who would come out on top?